The year was 1878. The stagecoach wheels groaned a final complaint, churning a cloud of red dust that settled on everything like a fine coat of rust. This was Red Wind Bluff. It wasn't a town that announced itself with pride, but rather one that simply existed, hunched against the incessant wind that gave it its name. The wind was the first and last thing you noticed. It whistled through the gaps in the false-fronted buildings and set the blacksmith's sign to a rhythmic, lonely clatter, a tired, iron heartbeat for a town on the edge of nowhere. The sound was a constant reminder of friction, of things wearing down. From the cramped, stale air of the coach emerged Ivy Lockridge. She moved not with the delicate uncertainty of a woman unaccustomed to travel, but with a practiced economy of motion. Her boots landing squarely in the dust, her eyes, the color of warm honey with flecks of sunlit green, took in the single, wide street in a swift, assessing glance. They missed nothing: the thirsty look of the horses at the trough, the faded paint on the general store, the way the shadows clung to the alleyways even in the full glare of the afternoon sun. In her arms, she clutched a heavy wooden case, its corners reinforced with brass. It was her life, her trade, and her anchor in a world that was always moving. Inside rested a hand-crank sewing machine, a marvel of steel and precision that was her only true partner. The weight of it was a familiar comfort against her hip. She breathed in, and the air was a dry cocktail of dust, sun-baked wood, and the faint, sour tang of horse sweat. It was the smell of hardship, and she knew it well. Further down the street, leaning against a hitching post as if he were a part of it, stood Bo Strickland. He wasn't watching the stagecoach so much as he was watching the horizon beyond it, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if he could measure the wind and weigh the heat. He was a tall man, built with the kind of lean, hard strength that comes from working land that gives back very little. His shirt was a faded blue, the fabric worn thin across the broad set of his shoulders. He held the reins of a black stallion, a magnificent animal that shifted its weight with contained power, its coat absorbing the sunlight. Bo's stillness was profound. It wasn't the idleness of a man with time to waste, but the watchful patience of a predator or a man who had lost too much to be in a hurry for anything. He was the owner of the Coyote Lantern Ranch, a fact spoken by the quiet authority in his posture and the weary responsibility in his eyes. He was a widower, a detail etched into the lines around his mouth, silent as a headstone. Ivy's gaze drifted from the man to a piece of paper nailed to the sheriff's office wall, its edges fluttering in the wind. The lettering was stark and practical. Help wanted. Ranch hand needed for drought season. Pay in cash and evening meal. Inquire Coyote Lantern Ranch. The words were as blunt and unadorned as the landscape. Drought. The word hung in the air, heavier than the heat. It explained the tension in the town's shoulders, the desperate look in the horse's eyes. She adjusted the grip on her sewing case and walked toward the general store, the boardwalk groaning under her steps. The bell above the door jangled a tinny, cheerful sound that was immediately swallowed by the dim, cluttered interior. The place smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and the metallic scent of gunpowder. A man with a tired face and a dusty apron polished the counter with a rag that had seen better decades. "Good day," Ivy said, her voice clear. "I'm looking for the price on a bolt of canvas and some sturdy cotton thread." The storekeeper stopped his polishing and looked her over, his eyes lingering on the sewing case. A slow, thin smile stretched his lips, but it held no warmth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dry as a riverbed in July. "Round these parts, folks buy more bullets than they do needles and thread. A bolt of canvas will cost you dear, more than you'd think." He named a price that made Ivy's grip tighten on her case. It was extortion, plain and simple. She knew the value of her goods. And this was twice what it should be. The message was clear: this was not a place that welcomed new enterprise, especially one as delicate as hers. This was a place for survival. And survival here was measured in lead and steel, not in neat, even stitches. She thanked him coolly, her expression unreadable, and turned to leave. As she stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, a sound from across the street drew her attention. It was the low, rumbling sound of men's voices, punctuated by the clink of glass, spilling from the swinging doors of the Salt Cedar Saloon. A group of cowboys lounged on the porch, their chairs tilted back against the wall. They weren't locals. Their gear was too new, their faces unfamiliar and etched with a hardness that went beyond the sun and wind. As she passed, their conversation died. A heavy silence fell, and she could feel their eyes on her, a physical weight on her back. It wasn't a look of friendly curiosity. It was a possessive, calculating gaze that stripped away her profession and saw only a woman, alone and new to their territory. She kept her chin high and her pace steady, her knuckles white where she clutched the handle of her case. She had felt those kinds of eyes before, and she knew not to show fear. It was then that the black stallion threw its head back with a sharp, impatient snort. The sudden movement was violent, a coil of muscle and frustration unleashing itself. Bo Strickland. His attention pulled from the horizon for the first time, turned to soothe the animal, his hand going to its neck, but the motion had been too sharp. A leather strap on the saddle, old and dried by the relentless sun, gave way with a sickening pop. The heavy saddle, with its intricate tooling and silver conchos, shifted precariously, threatening to slide off the horse's back and spook it into a blind panic down the main street. Bo cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound of frustration. He grabbed for the saddle, trying to hold it in place while simultaneously calming the agitated horse. It was an impossible, clumsy dance. Ivy didn't hesitate. She set her heavy case down on the boardwalk with a solid thud. In a single, fluid motion, she had a leather-working needle, thick and curved, and a spool of waxed thread from a pocket in her skirt. She was moving before anyone, including Bo, had fully registered what was happening. She closed the distance in a dozen quick strides. "Hold him steady," she commanded, her voice cutting through the tension. It was not a request. Bo, startled by her sudden appearance at his side, instinctively did as he was told, his hands firm on the stallion's bridle. The horse rolled its eyes, its skin twitching, but the rancher's grip was absolute. Ivy's fingers were a blur of efficiency. She found the torn strap, her eyes instantly assessing the damage. It was a clean break, but the leather was brittle. A simple stitch wouldn't hold. She pulled a small, round piece of scrap leather from another pocket. A patch, always prepared. She didn't ask for permission. She simply worked, her hands strong and sure. She pushed the big needle through the tough hide, her movements precise and powerful. One stitch, then another, locking them with a practiced knot. She wove the thread through the patch, reinforcing the tear, creating a new anchor point. It was not a beautiful repair, but it was strong. It would hold. The entire act took less than a minute. She pulled the final knot tight with a decisive tug and stepped back. "That'll get you home," she said, her voice even, though her heart was beating a little faster from the sudden burst of action. Bo Strickland stared at her hands, then at the saddle, which now sat securely on the horse's back. He ran a gloved finger over her work. The stitches were tight, ugly, and undeniably effective. He finally lifted his eyes to hers. They were a startling shade of gray, the color of a sky just before a storm. He saw the flecks of sunlight in her honey-colored eyes and the smudge of dust on her cheek. "You're quick with your hands," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough like worn leather. It was a simple statement of fact. Ivy allowed a small smile to touch her lips, a brief flash of warmth in the harsh afternoon. She picked up her heavy case, the weight settling back into its familiar place against her. "I'm quicker with my tongue," she replied, the challenge in her tone unmistakable. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps even amusement, passed through his storm-gray eyes. His mouth remained a grim, straight line, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease by a fraction. At that exact moment, a gust of wind, stronger than the rest, slammed down the street. It kicked up a vortex of red dust and pushed the swinging doors of the Salt Cedar Saloon inward with a loud bang. For a heartbeat. The dark interior of the saloon was framed in the doorway. A man stood there, silhouetted against the gloom. He was leaning against the bar, but his head had turned at the sound of the commotion outside, even as a shadow. His presence was sharp, magnetic. He pushed himself off the bar and took a step forward, the light catching the silver buckle on his gun belt. Jackson Redding. The name wasn't known to Ivy, but it was a name whispered in places like this, a name that could mean reformed outlaw or one just waiting for his next score. Beau's reaction was instantaneous. He went rigid. The flicker of amusement in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stillness that was more menacing than any outward threat. His hand, which had been resting on the stallion's neck, dropped almost imperceptibly closer to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. It was a subtle shift, a tightening of the spring, a man bracing for a fight he knew was long overdue. Ivy felt the change in him like a drop in temperature. Her own breath caught in her throat. She didn't know the man in the doorway, but she saw the recognition and the raw animosity that passed between him and the rancher. It was an old story, written in the sudden, violent tension that seized the air. The clatter of the blacksmith's sign, the low murmur from the saloon, the lazy buzz of a fly, it all faded away. The rhythm of Ivy's heart stuttered, knocked off beat. The rhythm of Beau's heart hardened into a slow, heavy drum. The town of Red Wind Bluff fell silent, holding its breath under the vast, indifferent sky, waiting for the storm that had just appeared on the horizon. The drought was not a guest, it was the landlord. It had evicted the water, foreclosed on the green, and now it owned everything. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, bleached by a sun that offered heat without warmth. The earth, once a rich red, had cracked into a mosaic of fissures, patterns of thirst so deep you could lose a coin in them. At the heart of Beau Strickland's land, Blue Lantern Creek had given up its ghost. What was once a life-giving artery was now a dry, winding scar. The water was gone, leaving behind a boneyard of smooth, white stones that lay scattered along the creek bed like the skeleton of some great, consumed serpent. The wind, no longer cooled by moisture, blew hot and gritty across the land, carrying the taste of dust and defeat. This was the reality Beau offered Ivy when she rode out to the Coyote Lantern Ranch 2 days after their encounter in town. He didn't offer a tour. He offered an inventory of decay. He led her not to a welcoming ranch house, but to the tack room. The air inside was thick with the scent of old leather and neat's foot oil, but also with the smell of failure. He pointed. A pile of saddle blankets, their wool frayed and torn, their edges chewed by time and use. A stack of canvas water bags, their seams split, dark stains marking where precious water had wept out into the dust. A set of leather hobbles, one strap snapped clean in two. "The drought's hard on the gear," he said, his voice flat. "Leather dries, thread rots, things break." He gestured toward a small, fenced-off pen near the barn. A handful of calves, smaller and weaker than they should be, wobbled on unsteady legs. It's harder on the new life. They're coming early. The mothers are too stressed to carry them to term. They need watching. He wasn't asking for help so much as stating a problem. He was a man drowning in a sea of small, relentless collapses. Every broken strap, every leaky bag, every weak calf was another wave washing over him. Ivy looked at the pile of broken things. Where he saw decay, she saw work. She saw a purpose. She ran her hand over a cracked leather cinch. Her touch was diagnostic, her fingers tracing the weaknesses, feeling the possibilities. "You need a mender," she said. It wasn't a question. "I need someone who isn't afraid of work," he corrected, his gray eyes watching her, gauging her. "I can't pay much. A corner of the storeroom off the main house, a place at the table for meals, a few dollars when the month turns, assuming the month turns in my favor." It was less an offer and more a dare. The storeroom. She saw when he showed her. was little more than a large closet, windowless, smelling of dried beans and dust. It held sacks of flour, spare horseshoes, and the quiet loneliness of a place for forgotten things. But it had a solid door and a roof that didn't leak. It was a foothold. "I accept," she said, setting her wooden case down on the floor. The sound was definitive. She looked up at him, her gaze direct. "And I'm not slow." A muscle in his jaw tightened, the only sign that he remembered her words in town. "See that you're not," he said, and the deal was struck. Life at the Coyote Lantern settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. But on that first evening, as the sky bled from orange to a deep, bruised purple, Bo laid down the law. They stood on the porch of the main house, looking west. The land stretched out, a vast expanse of sagebrush and rock, rising toward a jagged line of dark cliffs that cut into the horizon like broken teeth. "That's Raven Shelf," he said, his voice low and devoid of any warmth. "You don't go there. You don't go past it. There's nothing for you out there but trouble. That's my only rule." Ivy looked at the dark silhouette of the cliffs. They seemed to pull the last of the light into themselves, a place of shadows and secrets. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that doesn't ask questions," he said, and the finality in his tone closed the subject. It was a border, not just on a map, but in their conversation, a place she was forbidden to go. She learned later, from the quiet talk of the two other ranch hands, grizzled men named Silas and Pete, that Raven Shelf had been a hideout for rustlers and road agents for years, a place where the law didn't reach and men disappeared. The world beyond the ranch continued to turn, its whispers carried in on the hot wind. A dust-caked circuit preacher, stopping for a night to rest his horse, brought news from the north, a massive gold shipment. The quarterly earnings from the mines in Mesa Yarrow County was scheduled to be moved soon. It would travel the old stage road, a route that passed within 20 miles of Red Wind Bluff. The preacher spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the mere mention of that much gold could conjure demons. A few days later, a trapper passing through claimed he'd found strange boot prints in Dry Comet Basin, a desolate stretch of badlands east of the stage road. The prints weren't from a cowboy's boot. The heel was wrong, the sole too wide. They were tracks left by men who walked more than they rode, men who waited. The rumors were distant thunder, a storm still far away. Ivy's world was smaller, more immediate. She set up her workshop in the hay barn. The air was sweet with the smell of dried alfalfa and clover, and shafts of dusty sunlight cut through the gaps in the walls. She cleared a space, set her heavy wooden case on an overturned crate, and opened it. The black and gold sheen of her sewing machine was a stark contrast to the rustic wood and hay around it. It was a piece of the modern world, a tool of precision and speed in a place governed by older, slower forces. The sound of her work became a new part of the ranch's chorus. The rhythmic clatter-clatter-clatter of the hand-cranked machine was a steady, mechanical heartbeat that joined the lowing of cattle, the whistle of Silas as he mended a fence, and the constant, sighing voice of the wind. She worked through the pile of broken gear with a relentless efficiency. The saddle blankets were patched with neat, strong squares of canvas. The water bags were turned inside out, their seams cleaned and stitched with waxed thread, then sealed with pine tar until they were watertight once more. She was mending the ranch, one stitch at a time, holding it together against the drought's slow, persistent effort to pull it apart. One afternoon, she was working on a worn shirt of Bo's, reinforcing the collar. As she turned it over, a small object fell from the breast pocket and landed in her lap. It was a man's handkerchief, made of fine, soft linen, now yellowed with age. In one corner, embroidered with a delicate, skillful hand, was the letter B in a curling blue thread. It was an elegant, personal thing, completely at odds with the harsh, practical world of the ranch. When Bo came into the barn later, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, she held it up. "I found this in the shirt you gave me to mend." He stopped. His gaze fell on the handkerchief, and the weariness in his face hardened into something else, something closed and sharp. He didn't move for a long moment. The lively sound of the barn seemed to fade, replaced by a sudden, heavy silence. "It belonged to my wife," he said. His voice was quiet, but it was like the scrape of steel on stone. He walked over, took the handkerchief from her outstretched hand without his fingers touching hers, and folded it carefully before putting it in his own pocket. He said nothing more. He simply turned and walked out, leaving Ivy alone with the clatter of her machine and the profound, echoing silence of a door slamming shut on the past. Their interactions were a series of these small, unspoken negotiations, two solitary orbits learning to coexist in the same small solar system. The kitchen became their primary battleground. It was a large, warm room, the heart of the house, with a massive cast-iron stove and a long wooden table scarred by decades of use. They fell into a routine. Bo would handle the meat, what little there was, and the coffee. Ivy took over the bread, her biscuits a revelation to the ranch hands, and the beans. One evening, they found themselves in a silent standoff over the large pot of beans simmering on the stove. Ivy tasted it, her brow furrowed in concentration. She reached for the salt cellar. "It doesn't need it," Bo said, his voice coming from behind her. "It's flat," she countered, not looking at him. "It needs salt to bring out the flavor." "I don't like my food salty." "This isn't salty, it's seasoned. There's a difference." She sprinkled a small amount into the pot and stirred. He moved to stand beside her, took a clean spoon, and dipped it in. He tasted it, his expression giving nothing away. Then he turned to the spice rack, took down a tin of chili powder, and added a heaping spoonful to the stew, turning it a muddy red. He stirred it once, placed the spoon on the counter with a quiet click, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Ivy stared at the pot. He hadn't added flavor. He had added a declaration of ownership. It was his kitchen, his beans, his ranch. She had added salt. He had added a spoonful of silence and defiance. Night was when the true nature of the place revealed itself. The vastness of the land became a vastness of darkness, and the sky, free from the haze of the day, exploded with a cold, brilliant spray of stars. But the darkness was not empty. It was filled with sounds. The yipping chorus of coyotes would start up, a wild, lonely sound that was part laughter and part lament. It was the sound of everything beyond the small, fragile circle of light cast by the lamps in the ranch house. One night, unable to sleep, Ivy slipped out of her storeroom and onto the long front porch. The air was cooler, the wind a soft whisper, and she saw him. Bo was sitting in a chair at the far end of the porch, a Winchester rifle resting across his lap. He was a motionless silhouette against the starlit sky, and he was looking west. His gaze was fixed on the dark, jagged line of Raven Shelf. He wasn't resting. He was standing watch. He was a sentinel guarding his kingdom against the encroaching shadows, both the ones that crept in from the wilderness and the ones that lived behind the wall he had built around his past. He was watching for Jackson Redding, for the ghosts of the outlaws on the cliff, for the memory of his wife, for anything that threatened the fragile peace he had fought so hard to maintain. Ivy stood there in the shadows, watching him. The distant coyotes howled, and it sounded like a prophecy. High above, thin clouds began to drift across the stars, the first sign of a weather front moving in. It was a forecast of storms, of a change in the oppressive heat. But standing there, watching the lonely, armed man staring into the darkness, Ivy knew the storm on the horizon was nothing compared to the one that was gathering in the heart of the Coyote Lantern Ranch. The sun was barely a promise in the east, a faint blush of rose and gold against the dark canvas of the retreating night. A cool, clean air, the last gift of the darkness before the day's heat took hold, washed over the plains. Ivy was already moving. She saddled the mule, A creature named Soot for his dark, unassuming coat and his quiet, stubborn disposition. His temperament suited her. He was reliable, not flashy, and possessed a deep well of endurance that often surprised those who judged him by his size. Her task this morning was a delivery. The barkeep at the Salt Cedar Saloon. A man with a perpetually sour expression named Finch had hired her to repair a set of heavy canvas curtains torn during a brawl the previous week. It wasn't the sort of work she preferred. The fabric smelled of stale beer, old smoke, and regret, but it was paying work. And in a land gripped by drought, you didn't turn down coin. She loaded the neatly folded and stitched curtains into a burlap sack and tied it securely behind Soot's saddle. The ride to Red Wind Bluff was quiet. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sun to assert its full, brutal authority. A lone hawk circled high overhead, a gliding speck in the vast, empty sky. As she approached the town, the familiar, rhythmic clatter of the blacksmith's sign reached her. A lonely, metallic greeting. The town was still half asleep. A few early risers swept the boardwalks or loaded wagons, but the main street was mostly deserted. The Salt Cedar Saloon, however, was already showing signs of life, even from a distance. She could hear the low murmur of voices and the discordant plink of a poorly tuned piano. The place seemed to generate its own grim energy, a pocket of noise and shadow that resisted the clean light of the morning. She dismounted, tied Soot to the hitching post, and hefted the sack over her shoulder. The swinging doors creaked as she pushed them open, and she stepped from the bright, quiet morning into a world of perpetual twilight. The air inside hit her like a physical blow. It was thick and heavy, a foul stew of spilled whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the lingering bitterness of last night's cigar smoke. A few men were scattered around the room, nursing drinks at the bar or hunched over a card game in the corner. Their eyes, dull and bloodshot, turned to her as she entered. The piano player, a thin man with a drooping mustache, faltered for a moment before resuming his melancholy tune. And then she saw him. Jackson Redding was sitting alone at a table in the center of the room, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in front of him. Unlike the other men, his eyes were sharp and clear, and a slow, easy smile played on his lips as he watched her approach. He was handsome in a way that was both charming and unsettling, like a beautiful knife. He was dressed in black, but his clothes were well-tailored, a stark contrast to the rough workwear of the others. He looked like a man who had left a past behind but hadn't quite decided what to do with his future. He pushed a nearby chair out with his boot, a silent invitation. "Well, look what the morning wind blew in," he said, his voice a smooth, low drawl that cut through the gloom. The angel of mercy for torn curtains. Ivy ignored the chair and walked to the bar, dropping the heavy sack on its scarred wooden surface. "I have a delivery for Mr. Finch," she said, her voice businesslike. Finch, the barkeep, emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a filthy apron. He grunted, untied the sack, and inspected her work with a critical eye. He tugged at the seams, held the canvas up to the grimy light from the window, and finally, grudgingly, nodded. "It'll do," he muttered, and counted out a few coins onto the bar. As Ivy was pocketing the money, Jackson spoke again, his voice closer this time. He had moved to stand beside her. "That's fine work, Miss Lockridge. You have a real talent for mending what's broken." He paused, his eyes gleaming with a kind of playful challenge. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate level. "Tell me, can a seamstress as skilled as you sew up a broken heart?" The few men who were listening chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of amusement. Ivy didn't flinch. She turned to face him, her expression calm, her honey-green eyes meeting his without a flicker of intimidation. "I can," she said, her voice steady and clear, loud enough for the others to hear. "As long as you can stand the pain." a beat of surprised silence, and then the men roared with laughter. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh this time. Not at her, but with her. Jackson himself looked taken aback for a second before a wide, appreciative grin spread across his face. He tipped his head in a gesture of concession. A sharp needle and a sharper wit, a dangerous combination. The laughter died as if it had been strangled. Crack! The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't the boom of a rifle, but the sharp, whip-like report of a Colt revolver. A new hole, small and neat, appeared in the wooden door frame, a foot above Jackson Redding's head. Splinters of wood rained down on the dusty floor. Every man in the saloon froze, hands hovering over cards and glasses. The piano player stopped mid-note, leaving a hanging, dissonant chord in the air. Bo Strickland stood just outside the swinging doors, which had been blasted open by his arrival. The morning sun silhouetted him, making him seem larger and more menacing than he was. In his hand, the Colt was still raised, a thin curl of gray smoke rising from its barrel. He lowered it slowly, his eyes never leaving Jackson. His face was a mask of cold fury. His gray eyes narrowed to slits, as sharp and unforgiving as a surgeon's scalpel. The air in the room became thick and unbreathable, charged with a voltage that had nothing to do with the morning and everything to do with the past. Jackson turned his head slowly, the smile gone from his face, replaced by a look of weary recognition. He didn't seem surprised, or even particularly afraid. He just looked tired, as if this was a conversation he had been expecting for a very long time. "Strickland," Jackson said, his voice quiet. It was a statement, not a greeting. "Redding," Bo bit back, the name an epithet on his tongue. No one else spoke. No one else moved. The history between the two men filled the saloon, an invisible, suffocating presence. It was a story Ivy couldn't read, but she could feel its weight. It was in the rigid set of Bo's shoulders and the careful, deliberate way Jackson rested his hand on the table, inches from the butt of his own holstered pistol. It was a story of stolen cattle, of a chase through a moonless night years ago, of a betrayal that had never been settled. It was a blood feud, simmering just beneath the surface, that had now, finally, boiled over. Ivy reacted on pure instinct. This was not her fight. This was a powder keg, and she was standing right next to the fuse. She stepped between them. It was a foolish, dangerous move, but it was the only thing she could think to do. She turned her back on Bo, a deliberate act of trust or recklessness, and faced the barkeep. "Is our business concluded, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice tight but controlled. Finch, pale and sweating, could only nod, his eyes darting between the two armed men. "Then I'll be on my way." She didn't look at Jackson. She didn't look at Bo. She focused on the swinging doors, on the promise of clean air and open space. She walked forward, her steps measured, expecting at any moment the shattering explosion of another gunshot. She could feel the tension behind her, a physical force pressing against her back. She reached the doors and pushed through them, stepping out into the sunlight, which now felt impossibly bright. She took a deep, shuddering breath. A moment later, Bo was beside her, his Colt now back in its holster. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence a silent, forbidding wall. He took her arm, his grip firm but not rough, and started walking her toward her mule. The silence between them was taut as a newly stretched rein, humming with unspoken questions and unreleased violence. They were halfway down the trail back to the ranch, Bo riding his black stallion a few paces behind her and Soot, when the world dissolved into chaos. It started with a series of dull, popping sounds from a rocky outcrop to their left, followed by plumes of thick, acrid smoke. The smoke wasn't black, but a dirty, grayish yellow, and it smelled foul, like sulfur and burnt chemicals. Smoke bombs. They had been deliberately placed. The effect on the small herd of coyote lantern cattle grazing peacefully in the nearby meadow was instantaneous and terrifying. The placid animals, startled by the noise and choked by the smoke, erupted into a blind panic. Lowing in terror, they surged to their feet and began to run. A stampede. Not a large one, maybe 50 or 60 head, but more than enough to be deadly. And they were running in the one direction they shouldn't, straight toward a narrow wooden bridge that spanned a deep, rocky arroyo a quarter of a mile ahead. The old bridge was barely strong enough for a wagon. It would never hold the weight and force of a herd of terrified cattle. It would collapse, sending the animals plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. It was a deliberate, calculated act of sabotage. There was no time to think. Bo spurred his horse forward, drawing level with her. "Ride!" he yelled, his voice raw. "Get ahead of them. Turn the lead steer." He veered off, his horse eating up the ground as he raced to get to the flank of the herd. He uncoiled the bullwhip from his saddle, the long leather tail hissing as he prepared to use it. Ivy didn't need to be told twice. She kicked Soot into a gallop. The little mule, sensing the urgency and fear in the air, responded with a burst of speed she didn't know he possessed. The thunder of hooves behind them was a deafening roar, a force of nature that threatened to swallow them whole. The air filled with dust, so thick she could barely see, so gritty she could taste it on her teeth. She pushed Soot harder, urging him on. Her world narrowed to the space directly in front of her. She could see the lead steer now, a big, powerful animal, its eyes wide with terror, running blindly toward the bridge. She had to get in front of it. It was a suicidal maneuver. If Soot stumbled, if she was a second too slow, they would be trampled into the dirt. She angled the mule, cutting across the steer's path. She was shouting, waving her arms, trying to make herself a bigger, more frightening obstacle than the fear that was driving the animal forward. At the same time, she heard the explosive crack of Bo's whip, again and again, as he worked the side of the herd, trying to push them, to turn their blind flight away from the bridge. For a terrifying moment, it seemed hopeless. The lead steer was going to hit them. Ivy could see the slobber on its muzzle, the wild terror in its eyes. She closed her own eyes, bracing for the impact. But then, Soot, the stubborn, steady mule, did something extraordinary. He planted his feet, lowered his head, and brayed. A defiant, ear-splitting sound of pure obstinacy. It was enough. The lead steer, confronted with this strange, loud obstacle, faltered. It hesitated for a single, crucial second, turning its head. That was all Bo needed. With a final, desperate crack of his whip and a powerful shove from his horse, he managed to turn the flank. The lead steer, its momentum broken, followed the new pressure. The rest of the herd, a single-minded organism of panic, followed its leader. They veered away from the bridge, their stampede carrying them out onto the open plain, where their fear would eventually run its course. The thunder of their hooves receded. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the heaving breaths of horse and mule, and the ragged gasps of the two riders. Dust, thick and red, settled slowly around them, coating them in a fine powder. Ivy was trembling, her hands locked onto Soot's reins. Bo rode up beside her, his face grim, his shirt dark with sweat. His horse was lathered, its sides heaving. For a long moment, they just sat there, breathing in the dusty air. The bridge, still intact, just 100 yards away. Ivy found her voice first. It was shaky, but it was there. She looked at him, at the raw concern that had momentarily replaced the cold anger in his eyes. "You owe me a thank you," she said, the words tasting of dust and adrenaline. Bo looked from her to the bridge, and then back again. A muscle worked in his jaw. He let out a slow, controlled breath. "You owe me a promise," he answered, his voice low and rough. "Don't go slow when I tell you to run." The sky broke without warning. One moment, The world was held in the familiar, oppressive grip of the heat, the air still and heavy. The next, a single, fat drop of rain struck the dusty ground with a hiss, leaving a dark circle that was immediately followed by another, and then 1,000 more. The unseasonal storm swept across the plains not as a gentle relief, but as a sudden, violent deluge, a torrent of cold water that hammered the parched earth. The sound on the tin roof of the ranch house was deafening, a frantic, percussive rhythm that drowned out all other noise. It was the sound of the world being washed clean. Ivy was caught in the open, wrestling with a heavy wool blanket she had been trying to air out on the clothesline. The wind that preceded the downpour had turned it into a wild, bucking sail, and she was struggling to unpin it when the first drop struck her. Within seconds, she was soaked. The cold water plastered her simple cotton dress to her skin and ran in rivulets down her face. Her hair, which she usually kept pinned in a neat, practical bun, came loose, and a wet strand clung to the nape of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, shocking cold. Giving up on the blanket, she left it to the mercy of the storm and made a mad dash for the shelter of the house, laughing as the rain chased her onto the porch. She stood there for a moment, dripping onto the wooden planks, pushing the wet hair from her eyes and catching her breath. The world outside the porch was a churning gray chaos of wind and water. Inside, through the window, she could see the golden, steady light of a lamp. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped her as she entered, a welcome embrace against the chill of her wet clothes. It was a different world in here. Bo was standing by the stove, his back to her, grinding coffee beans. The sharp, earthy aroma of the freshly ground coffee filled the air, a rich and comforting scent. As the rain continued its furious drumming on the roof, a new smell began to seep in from the outside, the clean, almost sweet fragrance of damp earth, of dust that had finally had its thirst quenched. The two scents, the dark, roasted aroma of the coffee and the fresh, vital smell of the rain-soaked ground, mingled together to create the perfume of sanctuary. Bo turned, his movements slow and deliberate. He saw her standing there, soaked and shivering, a puddle forming at her feet. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned away, took a thick, clean towel from a hook by the stove, and tossed it to her. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the din of the storm. It was the closest he had come to expressing concern. Ivy caught the towel and began to dry her hair, the rough fabric a welcome friction against her cold skin. "It's only water," she replied, a smile in her voice. "The land needs it more than I need to be dry." He didn't answer, but instead busied himself with the coffee pot, measuring out the grounds and pouring in the water. They existed in a comfortable silence for a while, the storm providing all the conversation they needed. The ranch dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Thimble, crept into the kitchen and huddled under Ivy's chair, his small body trembling from the cold and the noise, his occasional whines the only punctuation in the roar of the rain. Later, as they sat at the long wooden table, nursing steaming mugs of black coffee, the enforced intimacy of the storm began to work its subtle magic, eroding the carefully constructed walls between them. The coffee was strong and slightly scorched, the way Bo always made it, but its heat spread through Ivy's chest, chasing away the last of the chill. "You never said what brought you so far west," Bo said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the rain. He was staring into his mug as if he could find answers in its dark depths, or what you were running from. Ivy wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic of her own mug. She thought for a moment, not of what to say, but of how to say it. "I wasn't running from anything," she said softly. "I was running to something. I'm from a town called Elm Pike. It's a nice place, I suppose, green, orderly. Everyone knows your name, your family, your business. They know the path you're meant to walk before you've even taken your first step." She looked up, her gaze meeting his across the table. My path was supposed to lead to a good marriage, a small house with a white fence, and a life spent mending other people's clothes and other people's lives. I wanted to mend my own. She paused, taking a sip of coffee. I wanted the freedom to make my own mistakes, to build something that belonged only to me, even if it was just a small business out of a wooden case, out here. She gestured vaguely toward the window and the storm-lashed world beyond it. The land is hard, but it's honest. It doesn't promise you anything it can't deliver, and it doesn't care who your father was. Bo was silent for a long time, his knuckles white where he gripped his mug. The lamplight carved deep shadows into the lines on his face, making him look older, wearier. Freedom has a high price, he said, his voice raspy. It's the only thing worth paying for, she replied gently. Then she took a chance. You lost your wife out here. That's what they say in town. The wall went up instantly. His shoulders stiffened, and the warmth that had begun to creep into the space between them vanished, replaced by a sudden, Arctic cold. He looked as if she had struck him. What they say in town is none of their business. I'm sorry, she said quickly, her heart sinking. I shouldn't have... He cut her off, not with anger, but with a voice hollowed out by a grief so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. It was 3 seasons ago, he said, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen wall. We were up in the high country, checking the summer pastures, a campfire, a sudden gust of wind. Like tonight, the grass was dry, so dry. He stopped, swallowing hard. It happened so fast. One moment, she was there, laughing. The next, there was just fire. He fell silent, the single word hanging in the air between them, thick with smoke and memory. He had shared the facts, but he had kept the heart of the story locked away, a charred and painful secret that he alone would carry. In the quiet that followed, filled only by the drumming rain and Thimble's soft whimpers, Ivy felt a profound shift. He had answered her intrusion not with a slammed door, but by opening it just a crack, letting her see a glimpse of the terrible, desolate landscape within. Later that evening, the storm still raging. Ivy sat by the fire in the main room, her sewing basket at her side. She had taken one of Bo's work shirts to mend, the one that had been torn on a fence post a few days prior. It was a simple, practical garment of faded blue cotton, scarred by work and time, as her needle worked to close the tear with small, neat stitches. She found herself thinking of the scars he carried on the inside. On an impulse, she took out a skein of deep blue silk thread. With patient, practiced movements, she began to embroider a small figure on the pocket, just above the mended tear. It was a heron, its long neck gracefully curved, its single leg planted firmly, a symbol of stillness and self-reliance. The soft, smooth silk of her stitches was a stark contrast to the rough, worn fabric of the shirt, a small patch of beauty laid over a landscape of old wounds. Bo came in to add another log to the fire. He stopped when he saw what she was doing, his shadow falling over her work. He watched her fingers guide the needle, creating the elegant bird from nothing but thread and skill. He didn't speak, but she could feel his gaze on her hands, and she did not falter, her rhythm steady and sure. When the stew was ready, she carried the heavy iron pot to the table. He moved to help her, to take the weight from her. As they shifted the pot onto the trivet, his hand brushed against hers. It was the briefest of contacts, skin against skin, calloused and rough against smooth and nimble. A spark, small but undeniable, arced between them. They both froze for a fraction of a second. A moment of shared, unspoken acknowledgement. It was an accident, a simple consequence of two people moving in a small space. But their hearts, which had been keeping a slow, solitary rhythm, suddenly faltered, skipping a beat in unison before resuming, a little faster, a little less steady than before. They pulled their hands back quickly, as if burned, and neither of them mentioned it. They were about to sit down to eat when a loud, insistent banging on the front door cut through the sound of the storm. It was not the knock of a friend. It was the desperate, demanding sound of someone who was out of options. Thimble shot out from under the table, barking furiously. Beau's hand went instinctively to the pistol at his hip as he moved to the door. He opened it a few inches, his body blocking the entrance. Jackson Redding stood on the porch, a ghost washed up by the storm. He was drenched, his black clothes clinging to him, water streaming from the brim of his hat and the ends of his dark hair. He looked less like a charming rogue and more like a half-drowned animal seeking shelter. But even soaked and shivering, his eyes were sharp and awry. Weary smile touched his lips. "A man could drown out here. Strickland," Jackson said, his voice a low drawl, though it was rough around the edges. "I'm not asking for your hospitality. Just a dry spot by your fire until this breaks." Beau stood there for a long, tense moment, the rain and wind swirling in through the open door. Ivy could see the conflict in his face, the primal urge to slam the door on this specter from his past warring with the unwritten code of the West that said you don't turn a man away in a storm like this. Finally, with a grim, tight-lipped expression, he stepped back, allowing Jackson to enter. The atmosphere in the small house instantly became suffocating. Jackson took off his hat, running a hand through his wet hair, his presence filling the room. He moved toward the fire, drawn by its warmth, and it was then that his eyes fell on the shirt Ivy had laid over the back of a chair. He saw the newly mended tear, and above it, the small, perfect blue heron she had just finished. His gaze lifted from the shirt and settled on Ivy, a new, complex light dawning in his eyes, a mixture of surprise, calculation, and something that looked almost like regret. The meal that followed was an exercise in tension. The three of them sat at the long table, the empty chairs of the other ranch hands, who were bunking in the barn, serving as silent witnesses. The only sounds were the scrape of cutlery on plates, the relentless drumming of the rain, and the crackle of the fire. The air was thick with unspoken histories and unresolved conflicts. It was a shared table crowded with ghosts. Before they had even begun to eat, Beau stood up, walked to the large stone hearth, and took down his Spencer repeating rifle from the pegs where it rested, with a quiet, deliberate motion. He placed it on the gun rack that hung on the wall directly behind the dining table. The click of the heavy rifle settling into the wooden rack was as loud and definitive as a judge's gavel. It was not a threat of immediate violence. It was a statement. It was a line drawn in the sand. It was a cold, clear warning that this was his home, and he was the master of it. Jackson watched him, a slow, knowing smile touching his lips, but he said nothing. He ate his stew quickly and efficiently, like a man who never knew where his next meal was coming from. When he was finished, he pushed his chair back and stood up. "The storm is letting up," he said, though the rain still hammered against the windows. "And I've overstayed my welcome." He nodded toward Beau, a gesture that was not quite respectful. Then he turned his gaze to Ivy. His eyes were intense, holding hers for a long moment. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Lockridge," he said, his voice soft. He walked to the door and pulled on his still damp hat. With his hand on the latch, he paused and looked back at her one last time. A cold, mirthless smile played on his lips. "A piece of advice," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the room with perfect clarity. "Don't go slow. Out here, slow as dead." He opened the door and disappeared into the churning darkness, leaving behind a profound and chilling silence. Ivy walked to the window and watched him go. He was just a dark shape, moving through the downpour, his form distorted by the sheets of rain. She looked down at the ground outside, at the puddles that had formed in the yard. In the flickering lamplight from the house, the surface of the water reflected the scene like a dark, warped mirror. She could see the reflection of the warm light of the kitchen, the shadow of the man walking away into the night, and her own faint, wavering image, caught between the two. Three separate fates, their reflections now rippling together in the cold rainwater. their destinies intertwined and made murky by the storm. The discovery began, as most important discoveries do, in a moment of ordinary work. The day after the storm, the air was scrubbed clean and the world seemed sharper, the colors more vivid. A deceptive peace settled over the Coyote Lantern Ranch. Ivy was in the storeroom, the small, windowless space that had become her domain, taking inventory. The rain had found a small leak in the corner, and she was moving sacks of grain and flour away from the damp spot. The room was her sanctuary, a quiet place that smelled of burlap, dried beans, and the faint, metallic scent of her sewing machine's oil. She was wrestling with a 50-pound sack of flour, dragging it across the rough planked floor, when she noticed it was an anomaly. It wasn't one of Beau's usual suppliers from Red Wind Bluff, whose sacks were stamped with a familiar red rooster. This one was unmarked, made of a slightly finer canvas, and stitched shut with a different color of twine. It was a detail most would overlook. But Ivy's life was built on details, on the subtle differences in thread, weave, and tension. Her curiosity piqued. She ran her fingers along the top seam. Tucked beneath the fold, almost hidden, was a small, smudged square of paper, glued to the fabric. It was a postal stamp. Frowning, she leaned closer, using the corner of her apron to wipe away a film of dust. The postmark was faint, but the letters were legible. Wyeth Spur. The name struck her like a distant bell. Wyeth Spur. The circuit preacher had mentioned it. It was a dusty railhead town 100 miles to the north, the last stop before the mountain passes. It was the place where the gold from the Mesa Yarrow mines was collected, weighed, and loaded for transport. It was the starting point for the shipment that was now a subject of fevered whispers all across the territory. She stood there in the dusty silence of the storeroom, the heavy weight of the flour sack forgotten at her feet. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture she didn't want to see. The strange, hard-eyed men at the Salt Cedar Saloon. The carefully placed smoke bombs that had stampeded Beau's cattle toward the bridge. Jackson Redding's sudden, dramatic appearances and his cryptic warnings. It wasn't a series of random events. It was a plan, unfolding in the shadows. The saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was a post office of sorts, a hub for a network of unseen players. And this sack of flour, it wasn't just flour. It was a message, a delivery of supplies, a piece of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. She found Beau by the corral, replacing a rotted fence post. He worked with a grim, focused energy, his movements economical and powerful. The sun beat down on his back, and the muscles in his arms and shoulders coiled and released as he dug the post hole deeper. He was a man at war with his own land, determined to hold it together through sheer force of will. "Beau," she said, her voice cutting through the rhythmic scrape of his shovel against the hard earth. He didn't stop digging, but he grunted in acknowledgement. "I found something," she said. "In the storeroom. A sack of flour. It has a postmark on it, from Wyeth Spur." He finally stopped, leaning on the shovel, and wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow with the back of his gloved hand. He squinted at her, the bright sun making the gray of his eyes seem pale and washed out. "And Wyeth Spur," she repeated, willing him to make the connection. "That's where the gold shipment is coming from, the one the preacher was talking about." She took a breath and laid out her theory, her words clear and logical. "The men in the saloon, the stampede, it's all connected. They're using Red Wind Bluff, using the Salt Cedar as a staging ground. Jackson Redding is a part of it." He straightened up, tossing the shovel aside with a clatter. A dark, familiar anger settled over his features, his face becoming a mask of stone. "Jackson Redding is a back-shooting thief," he said, his voice low and hard. "That's all I need to know. I don't need some seamstress's theories about flour sacks and postmarks to tell me what kind of man he is." His words stung, but she held her ground. "This isn't about what kind of man he is," she insisted, her own voice rising with urgency. "This is about what he's planning to do. Your hatred for him is making you blind. You see him, And all you can see is the past. But this is about the future. Bo. A future that includes a gold shipment being robbed practically on your doorstep. This is my land. He bit back, his jaw tight. I'll handle any trouble that comes on it. You can't handle a dozen armed men by yourself, she shot back, taking a step closer. You can't fight a ghost. We don't even know what we're up against. We need more information. We need facts, not just old grudges. He stared at her, a silent battle of wills raging between them in the hot, still air. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the stubborn pride warring with the cold, hard logic of her words. Let me ride to Cedar Spire, she said, pressing her advantage. Cedar Spire was a larger town 30 miles east, a place with a proper telegraph and a federal post office. The postmistress there, Martha Albright, she's been there for 20 years. If there are strange shipments coming in from Wyeth Spur, if there's unusual mail passing through this area, she'll know about it. It's a way to get information that doesn't rely on the drunks at the Salt Cedar. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged line of Raven Shelf, the place where all his troubles seemed to originate. She had given him a course of action, a way to move forward that wasn't just a blind charge at an old enemy. He was a man who understood action. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. All right, he conceded, his voice grudging. We ride to Cedar Spire, but we're taking the old ridge trail. It's faster, and I can keep an eye on you. The old ridge trail was less a trail and more a suggestion. It was a narrow, winding path that clung to the high ground, a rocky spine that offered a commanding view of the plains below. The ride was tense. The air was thick with the things they had said and the things they hadn't. But beneath the tension, a new dynamic was forming. They were a team, moving with a shared purpose, however reluctantly. Cedar Spire was a world away from Red Wind Bluff. The streets were wider. The buildings were made of brick instead of weathered wood. And there was a sense of order, of permanence, that Red Wind Bluff lacked. The post office was a small but sturdy building. And inside, Martha Albright, a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, presided over her domain with an air of quiet authority. Ivy explained their purpose carefully, asking about supply shipments and any mail addressed to unfamiliar names in the Redwind area. Mrs. Albright listened patiently, her expression giving nothing away. The U.S. mail is a private matter, Miss, she said, her tone polite but firm. I'm not at liberty to discuss who sends or receives letters. It was a dead end. Frustrated, they turned to leave. As they reached the door, the postmistress called out, Mr. Strickland. They stopped and turned. Mrs. Albright was holding a single, dust-covered letter. This came through a while back, addressed to you, but at your old box in Redwind. So it was returned here. I was never sure where to send it on to after the fire. She held it out to him. Bo stared at the envelope as if he were seeing a ghost. He took it from her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Ivy saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped it. The address was written in a flowing, elegant script. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought she knew he thought it was a lost letter from his wife, a final message from beyond the grave. A flicker of raw, desperate hope illuminated his grim features, a look of such profound vulnerability that Ivy had to look away. She glanced at the handwriting on the envelope. Her heart sank. It was beautiful. Yes, but it wasn't the same delicate, precise script she had seen on the embroidered handkerchief. This handwriting was different. It was bolder, more angular, with a subtle, almost aggressive slant. It wasn't the hand of the woman who had embroidered a simple B with loving care, with trembling fingers. Bo broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Ivy watched his face as he read. She saw the flicker of hope extinguished, replaced by a wave of confusion, then dawning horror, and finally, a deep, soul-crushing despair that seemed to hollow him out from the inside. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, ashen gray. His hand dropped to his side, and the letter fluttered to the floor. Ivy bent down and picked it up. She felt she had no right, but she couldn't stop herself. Her eyes scanned the few, brutally concise lines. The embers of a fire can burn for a long time. Some debts are never paid in full. I was there. I saw everything. A wise man knows when to pay what he owes. It was unsigned, but at the very bottom of the page, there was a single, stark initial, drawn with a thick, deliberate stroke of the pen. R. The air in the small post office suddenly felt thin, impossible to breathe. Ivy looked up at Bo, and in his shattered gray eyes, she finally understood everything. R. Redding, Jackson. This was his power. This was the venom in his bite, the fire that had killed Bo's wife. Elena hadn't been a simple, tragic accident. There was more to the story, a secret, a lie, and Jackson Redding had been there. He was a witness, or perhaps something more. Bo's obsessive, all-consuming hatred wasn't just about a long-ago cattle dispute. It was a complex, tangled thing, rooted in the deepest trauma of his life, a grief poisoned by guilt and blackmail. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a silent, desolate country. The sun beat down, but neither of them felt its heat. Bo rode like a man in a trance, his face a blank mask of shock and grief. The confident, capable rancher had vanished, replaced by a broken man, his deepest wound torn open and laid bare for her to see. The silence was not angry or awkward. It was heavy, weighted with the terrible gravity of a shared secret. About 5 miles from the ranch, Bo abruptly reined in his horse, his eyes fixed on the ground. He dismounted and knelt, running his fingers over a set of tracks in the dusty trail. Ivy dismounted beside him. The tracks were from a shod horse, but they were unlike any she had ever seen. Forged into the side of the iron shoe was a third, sharp edge, like a small, crescent-shaped blade. It left a distinctive, 3-pointed mark in the dirt. It was a signature. "Redding's crew," Bo said, his voice flat and dead, utterly devoid of emotion. "They use a brand on their horses' hooves as well as their hides." It was the final, irrefutable proof. Their enemy was not some distant threat. He was here, now, moving freely across Bo's land, confident and untouchable. They stood up and looked at each other. In that moment, everything changed. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just the hired help. The carefully maintained distance between them had been obliterated. She knew his secret. She had seen the raw, unshielded core of his pain. She was the only person in the world who understood the true nature of the chains that bound him. She saw the despair in his eyes, the feeling of a man trapped, and she knew that if he was left alone, he would break. She had to pull him back from the edge. "Bo," she said, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with a strength he no longer possessed. "If we want to live through this, we have to move fast." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. He saw no pity there, only a fierce, intelligent resolve. He saw a partner. He was a man accustomed to leading, to giving orders, to being in absolute control. But his control was an illusion, shattered by a single piece of paper. He was lost in a fog of grief and betrayal, and he knew he could no longer trust his own judgment. He needed her clarity. He needed her speed. He let out a long, ragged breath, a sound of surrender and release. "You lead," he said, his voice raw but steady. "I'll watch our backs." They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was a new kind of silence, the focused, purposeful silence of two soldiers preparing for a battle they knew was coming. That night, Ivy sat in her small storeroom, the lamp casting a warm, flickering glow on the rough wooden walls. She took the letter from her pocket. She should have burned it, destroyed the poison it contained. But she couldn't. It was too important. It was the truth, however ugly. It was the key to everything. Carefully, she opened a small seam in the lining of her wooden sewing case, slipped the folded letter inside, and stitched the seam closed with a few neat stitches. It was invisible, hidden within the very heart of her livelihood. Her heart ached for the burden Beau carried, but she felt something else, too. A strange, fierce sense of purpose. By hiding his secret, she was now a part of his life in a way she had never intended. Her heart was no longer just her own. It was now a safe deposit box for his deepest pain, his most dangerous vulnerability. It was a trust she would not betray. She looked out the small, grimy opening that served as a window. A sliver of a new moon hung in the black, star-dusted sky. It was a perfect silver crescent, as beautiful and as sharp as a freshly honed scythe. Tomorrow, she thought, it would cut deep. Night fell like a hammer blow. There was no gentle twilight, only a swift and brutal transition from the blood red of sunset to a blackness so complete it felt solid. The moon was a prisoner behind a wall of high clouds, offering no light, no comfort. They moved through this suffocating darkness not by sight, but by memory and instinct. Beau led, his black stallion picking its way through the treacherous terrain with an unnerving confidence. Ivy followed on the mule, Soot, her trust placed entirely in the shadowy form of the man ahead of her. The only sounds were the clink of a horseshoe on stone, the creak of saddle leather, and the soft, insistent whisper of the wind. They were following the distinctive, three-pointed tracks. The trail climbed steadily. Leaving the relative safety of the plains behind, it became a broken, hostile landscape of shattered rock and steep inclines. They reached the edge of Raven Shelf. It was not a shelf so much as a wound in the earth, a sheer drop into a chasm of absolute black. The wind howled up from its depths, a mournful, hungry sound. Stunted pine trees, twisted and warped by a lifetime of fighting the wind, grew at impossible angles from the rock face, their dark forms like spears aimed at the starless sky. This was a place where things ended, a place to fall from. They dismounted, moving on foot, their steps slow and measured. Beau pressed a hand to Ivy's arm, a silent command to stop. He listened, his head cocked, his entire body a study in predatory stillness. And then they heard it, a low nicker from a horse, quickly stifled. It was close, too close. The reaction was instantaneous. A hiss cut through the air, and a single, brilliant point of light shot into the sky. A signal flare. It exploded overhead, bathing the jagged landscape in a harsh, chemical white glare. The sudden light was blinding, painting everything in stark, terrifying relief. For a heartbeat, they saw them. Two men, scrambling to their feet from behind a cluster of rocks. Further back, near a makeshift camp, other shadows moved in frantic, panicked confusion. The element of surprise was gone, incinerated in that single burst of light. Beau's rifle was already at his shoulder. The crack of the shot was sharp and definitive, a punctuation mark to the chaos. High above, the flare sputtered as the bullet found its mark, and the brilliant light began to fall, tumbling end over end. It landed in a patch of dry brush, its dying magnesium fire spewing a fountain of brilliant white sparks that threatened to ignite the entire cliffside. There was no time for a command. Ivy reacted. She ripped the canvas tarp from her saddle pack, the one she had mended just last week. While Beau reloaded, she lunged forward. She threw the heavy canvas over the sputtering flare with a great whoosh. The fabric smoked and hissed as it smothered the sparks, the acrid smell of burning tar filling the air. A man screamed a curse from the outlaws' camp, and then the last of the light was gone. Darkness, deeper and more absolute than before, swallowed them whole. It consumed the shouts, the landscape, the fear. "Move! Beau's voice was a low growl in her ear. He grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the edge of the chasm. They didn't run, they plunged, down a steep, treacherous slope of loose scree and gravel. It wasn't a path. It was a controlled fall, a desperate slide into the deeper shadows at the base of the cliff. The small rocks were like marbles under their boots, shifting and sliding, offering no purchase. Ivy lost her footing, her hands flying out to break her fall. A sharp, searing pain shot through her right palm as it scraped against the jagged edge of a rock. She cried out, a small, sharp sound that was swallowed by the noise of their descent. They came to a jarring halt behind a massive boulder, their lungs burning, their bodies bruised. The sounds from above were confused now, men shouting and stumbling in the disorienting blackness. They were safe. For the moment. "Are you hurt?" Beau's voice was tight, strained. "My hand," she gasped, cradling it to her chest. It was bleeding, a warm, sticky wetness in the cold night. He said nothing. He simply reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he took her wrist. He couldn't see the wound, but he could feel the blood. He released her, and she heard a soft tearing sound. He took her hand again. He wrapped something soft around her palm, his movements efficient and sure. He tied a knot, pulling it tight enough to apply pressure. Ivy realized what he was using a moment before the faint, familiar scent of old linen reached her. It was her own handkerchief, the one she had found in his shirt pocket, the one that had belonged to his wife. He had been carrying it all this time. The gesture was more intimate, more profound than any touch they had ever shared. A piece of his past, now used to mend her present. They stayed there, listening, letting the chaos above them play out. After a few minutes, two figures, cursing and complaining about the darkness, began to make their way down the same scree slope, sent to investigate. It was a foolish move. Beau drew his pistol. He waited until they were almost on top of them, their forms clumsy silhouettes against the slightly less black sky. He moved like a shadow detaching itself from the rock. There were two dull, heavy thuds, like melons splitting, followed by the soft sigh of bodies collapsing onto the gravel. It was over in seconds. Brutal, silent, final. They dragged the two unconscious men deeper into the shadows. Ivy's hands shook as she helped Beau bind their wrists and ankles with strips of leather from their own gun belts. They gagged them with their own bandanas. Beau slapped one of the men awake. The fear in the man's eyes was a palpable thing, even in the near-total darkness. The interrogation was short. Beau didn't need to raise his voice. His presence, cold and menacing, and the hard press of his pistol barrel against the man's temple were enough. They learned everything. The plan was simple and audacious. The official route for the gold wagon was public knowledge, but Jackson's crew had spent weeks building a decoy bridge over a shallow part of Dry Comet Basin, miles off the main road, while making the real bridge appear impassable. They would use a small diversion to force the wagon onto the new route, leading it directly into a narrow, inescapable canyon. It was a perfect trap. The lookout confirmed it. A crudely drawn map, scratched onto a piece of cured leather, was tucked inside his shirt pocket. They left the two men bound and gagged and moved deeper into the labyrinth of rocks, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the outlaw camp. They found a defensible spot, a narrow crevice between two towering slabs of granite, and sank to the ground. Their backs against the cold stone, they were hidden. They were alone. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the chilling reality of their situation. They were two people against a small, well-organized army. He looked at her, his face a landscape of shadows. He could just make out the pale oval of her face, the dark smudges of her eyes. "I shouldn't have brought you into this," he whispered, the words raw with a guilt that went far beyond their current predicament. She shook her head, though he could barely see the motion. "You didn't. I walked into it myself." She looked in the direction of the outlaw camp. "I won't leave you alone in this." "Beau," He reached out in the darkness, his hand finding hers, his fingers wrapping around her uninjured one. His grip was firm, a silent anchor in the terrifying night. "Then never be slow," he whispered back. It was not a declaration of love. It was something harder, something forged in this desperate moment. It was a pledge of allegiance, a quiet, solemn vow made in the heart of enemy territory. It was their own strange, whispered marriage proposal, witnessed only by the ancient, indifferent stones. As if in answer, a long, mournful howl echoed through the canyon, a lone wolf, singing its song to the absent moon. It was a sound of profound wildness and isolation, a reminder of just how far from safety they truly were. A moment later, they saw it, far across the basin, on a distant ridge. A series of lights appeared, torches. They moved in a line, a string of fiery beads against the black velvet of the night. It was Jackson's main force, moving into position, their numbers a terrifying, undeniable truth. They watched the distant lights, the scale of their problem laid out before them. Panic was a cold, slick thing, trying to find a purchase in Ivy's heart. She fought it down, her mind racing, her practical, problem-solving nature taking over. The stampede, the fake bridge, the diversion. It was a plan built on deception, and deception could be turned back on itself. "We can't fight them," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Not all of them, but we don't have to." Her mind was working quickly, stitching pieces of information together like patches on a quilt. "They used a diversion to try and destroy your herd at the bridge. They're planning to use another diversion to send the gold wagon to their fake bridge. What if we create our own diversion?" He was listening, his attention absolute. "What are you thinking?" "The bridge," she said, her idea taking shape. "Their trap. We don't try to stop them. We don't try to fight them. We spring their trap early. We use their own plan against them. We destroy their bridge before the gold wagon ever gets there. A loud, undeniable warning that the route is compromised. The guards will turn back, and Jackson's entire plan will fall apart." It was a bold, desperate gambit, but it was a plan. It was better than hiding. It was better than dying. Bo was silent for a moment, considering it. Then he squeezed her hand. "It's a good plan." He released her and reached into the small leather pouch on his belt. He pressed something small, cool, and heavy into her palm. It was a silver lighter. It was beautifully made, its surface worn smooth with use, its edges soft. On one side, engraved in a simple, strong script, was the letter B. "You'll need this for the fuse," he said. It was a practical statement, but it was so much more. He was giving her a tool, but he was also giving her his trust. He was entrusting her, the seamstress, with a fire that could save them. He was giving her a piece of himself. "Bo," she started, but he cut her off. "No time," he said, his voice firm. "I'll circle around, draw their attention, make them think I'm trying to get to the main road. I'll make a lot of noise. It'll give you the time you need to get to the bridge." He stood up, a tall shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows. "Be fast, Ivy," he said. "Don't get yourself killed," she replied. They stood there for one final heartbeat, two separate people in the vast, hostile darkness. Then they turned and moved in opposite directions. He, a ghost, moving toward the distant, deadly lights. She, a shadow slipping deeper into the canyon, the cold silver of his promise clutched tightly in her hand. They were separated by a mile of rock and danger, but they were bound by a single, desperate plan, their hearts beating to the same silent, frantic rhythm. The world beneath the bridge was a cage of shadows and dust. Ivy moved on her belly, the rough, splintered wood scraping against her clothes, the dry, alkaline smell of the creek bed filling her nostrils. Her world had shrunk to this crawl space, a coffin of crisscrossing timbers and oppressive silence. The pouches of black powder, scavenged from the captured lookouts, felt heavy and dangerous in her hands. She worked with the quiet, focused precision of a surgeon or a seamstress. Her fingers, nimble and sure, packed the powder against the two main support posts, the load-bearing heart of the structure. She wasn't building a bomb to obliterate. She was setting a charge to cripple, to send a message written in fire and splintered wood. She laid the fuse, a single continuous line in the dust, leaving it exposed so the spark would travel without impediment. Fast. She had to be fast. A shadow fell over her, not from a passing cloud, but from a solid form blocking the slivers of pre-dawn light. "You're as quick as a blade, Miss Lockridge." The voice was a low, familiar drawl. It came from directly above her. Ivy froze, her hand hovering over the end of the fuse. She looked up through the gaps in the planking. The silhouette of Jackson Redding stood on the bridge, looking down at her. He wasn't surprised. He had been waiting. She stayed perfectly still, her mind racing. He held all the cards. He could kill her now, and the plan would die with her. But he hadn't. He had spoken.
"I imagine you are, too,"
she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the frantic hammering of her heart against her ribs. She began to slowly, deliberately, crawl out from under the bridge, moving into the open. Her hands held where he could see them. She was vulnerable, but she would not be a victim cowering in the dark. He watched her emerge, a solitary figure in the vast, empty basin. He wasn't holding a gun. His hands rested on his hips, a gesture of casual authority. "Strickland's diversion was a nice touch," he said, a note of professional appreciation in his tone. "A big cloud of dust to draw the eye. But a dust cloud doesn't have a mind of its own. It doesn't have your brand of cleverness."
"So you came to investigate,"
she said, stating the obvious. "I always check my own stitches," he replied, the corner of his mouth ticking upward in a ghost of a smile. "Can't have any loose threads." She stood her ground, the cool silver of Bo's lighter a secret weight in her pocket. The air between them was still, charged with a tension that was different from before. It was less about threat and more about a final, inevitable reckoning.
"What do you want,
Jackson?" she asked, her voice clear and direct.
"What do you want besides the gold?"
His smile vanished. The question landed, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. He looked away, his gaze sweeping across the immense, lonely landscape, as if the answer was written out there in the rocks and the sagebrush. When he finally looked back at her, the charming, roguish mask was gone. His eyes were filled with a profound and terrible weariness, a hollowness that seemed to swallow the light. "A chance," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "a chance to be a man again." Before she could process the weight of his words, a new sound reached them, a low, distant rumble. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum. It was the sound of dozens of cattle, moving at a run. And from the east, a massive plume of dust began to rise against the pale morning sky. A man-made storm that was steadily growing, drawing all attention, all focus. Bo. He was doing it. He was risking his own herd, the sum of his life's work, to create the diversion she needed. The sight of it, so grand and so desperate, sent a surge of adrenaline and a fierce, painful wave of affection through her. The time for talk was over.
"He's keeping his promise,"
she said, her voice tight.
"Now I have to keep mine."
She dropped to one knee, her hand diving into her pocket. She pulled out the silver lighter. Boom! The explosion was a physical blow, a concussive force that slammed into her chest and ripped the air from her lungs. It was louder, more violent than she had ever imagined. The world became a chaotic symphony of splintering wood and groaning timbers. She looked up in time to see the center of the bridge heave upward, then collapse in on itself with a final, agonized scream of tortured lumber. It didn't fall completely, but it was broken, a jagged wound torn across the landscape. Impassable. In the distance, the rumble of the gold wagon, which had just come into view. ground to a halt. Shouts of alarm carried on the wind. Men, the outriders and guards, were spilling out, forming a defensive line, their rifles glinting in the new light. The trap was sprung. The alarm was sounded. Her plan had worked. Jackson had been thrown to his knees by the blast. He stared at the ruined bridge, his face a mask of disbelief, then fury, then something that looked like dawning comprehension. It was over. His grand scheme, his one chance to buy his way out of the life he was trapped in, had just gone up in smoke. He moved with the speed of a striking snake. He lunged at her, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. He wrapped an arm around her throat, pulling her back against him, the cold steel of the blade pressing against the soft skin of her neck. But something was wrong. His grip was strong, but the hand holding the knife was trembling, not with rage, but with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. His breath was ragged in her ear, a shuddering gasp. "What have you done?" he rasped, his voice breaking. "What have you done?" From the west, from the heart of the dust cloud, came the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. Then another. Bo was drawing their fire, playing his part to perfection. "I did what I had to do," Ivy said, her own voice surprisingly calm. The cold press of the blade seemed to focus her, sharpening her senses. "Now you need to do the same. Tell him the truth." "He wouldn't believe me," Jackson choked out, the words torn from him. "He'd kill me where I stand." "He'll kill you anyway," she countered, her logic as sharp and cold as his knife. "This is your one chance, Jackson, your one chance to be a man again." His arm trembled violently. A sound, half sob, half curse, escaped his lips. And then the confession spilled out of him, a torrent of poison that had been dammed up for 3 long years. "It wasn't me," he whispered, his voice cracking with the agony of the admission. "The fire. Elena, it wasn't my fault. I tried to stop him. I tried to pull her out." The knife shook, the edge scraping her skin. "It was Reeves Dalton. He was my partner then. He was the one who set the backfire. He said it was to cover our tracks after we spooked the cattle. But he was drunk, careless. He didn't care about the wind. He just laughed." The name Reeves Dalton hit Ivy with the force of a physical blow. The initial on the letter, R. It hadn't been for Redding. It had been for Reeves. At that exact moment, as if summoned by the speaking of his name, she saw him. On the ridge overlooking the canyon, a man on a tall gray horse had just appeared. He was too far away to make out his features, but he sat his horse with an air of absolute command. He raised his arm, about to give a signal to his men who were now exchanging fire with Bo's position. He was going to order an attack on the stalled wagon. "There!" Ivy screamed, her voice ripping through the air. She twisted against Jackson's hold, pointing with her free hand. "On the ridge, Bo! It's him! It's Reeves Dalton!" Jackson followed her gaze, his face a mask of horror and hatred. Her scream cut through the chaos, clear and piercing, across the basin, hidden in a swirl of dust and gun smoke. Bo heard her. He didn't know the name, but he heard the urgency, the certainty in her voice. He trusted it. He trusted her. He rose from behind the rock where he had taken cover. His Spencer rifle came up to his shoulder, its movement fluid, economical, certain. For one perfect, terrible second, he was completely exposed. He sighted down the long barrel, finding the figure on the ridge. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He fired. The sound of the shot was different. It was the deep, resonant boom of a hunting rifle, not the sharp crack of a pistol. It was a sound of finality. On the ridge, Reeves. Dalton jerked in the saddle as if he'd been struck by lightning. He hung there for a moment, a stunned puppet whose strings had just been cut. And then he pitched forward and slid from his horse, tumbling down the rocky slope like a discarded doll. The effect on the outlaws was instantaneous. Their leader was gone. The heart of their operation had just been shot out from under them. Confusion turned to panic. They were caught between the heavily armed wagon guards and the phantom riflemen in the dust. A few more shots were fired, but they were wild, panicked, without direction, and then they broke. They scattered like dry leaves in a gale, each man for himself, their grand plan for a fortune dissolving into a desperate, solitary flight for their own lives. In the sudden, ringing silence, a stray bullet, fired blindly by one of the fleeing riders, whined through the air. Ivy saw it coming, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She didn't think. She reacted. She shoved Jackson hard, pushing him away from her, putting her own body between him and the path of the bullet. He stumbled and fell, crying out in pain as the bullet tore through the fleshy part of his upper arm. It was a clean shot, painful but not fatal. He looked up at her from the ground, his face a mixture of shock, pain, and a dawning, incredulous gratitude. His eyes were wet. "You," he started, his voice thick. Ivy stood over him, her heart pounding. The silver lighter still clutched in her hand. The smoke from the explosion was beginning to clear, mingling with the gun smoke and the dust from the stampede. The world was slowly coming back into focus. Jackson pushed himself into a sitting position, clutching his bleeding arm. He looked at her, his gaze clear and direct, all the old masks stripped away. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, unadorned. "For not being slow." The sound of hoofbeats approached, fast and urgent. It was Beau, riding out of the dust cloud, his face a grim, searching mask. He saw them, Ivy standing, Jackson on the ground, bleeding and his face tightened. But there was no time for old hatreds. The air was still and quiet now. The gunfire had stopped. The dust was settling, and in the sudden, profound silence of the aftermath, Jackson Redding's confession hung between the three of them, as clear, as resonant, and as irrevocable as the tolling of a church bell. A strange, silent rain began to fall. It was not the clean, hard deluge of the storm, but a fine, gritty mist, composed of dust and ash and the lingering ghost of gun smoke. The air, scoured by the morning's violence, was now thick with its residue, and this spectral rain fell from a sky the color of a tarnished pewter cup, coating everything in a thin, gray film. The aftermath of the battle was not glorious. It was quiet, and it was dirty. Ivy stood in the center of the basin, the broken bridge a monument to their desperate victory behind her. She was trembling. It was a deep, uncontrollable shudder that began in the pit of her stomach and radiated outward to her fingertips. The adrenaline, that fierce, hot tide that had carried her through the fear and the chaos, was now receding, leaving her stranded on a desolate shore of cold and exhaustion. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did little to stop the shaking. The world seemed distant, muted, the edges blurred as if she were looking through smoked glass. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him, a frantic, desperate drumming that was the only sound in the unnaturally quiet world. Beau burst from the last tendrils of the dust cloud, his black stallion lathered and wild-eyed. He reined the horse to a skidding halt a few feet from her, his own face a mask of dust and raw, undisguised fear. He wasn't looking at the broken bridge, or at Jackson, who was now being tended to by one of the approaching wagon guards. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were locked on her, searching her, taking in every detail with a desperate intensity, as if he were trying to convince himself that she was real, that she was whole. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a complete stop, his movement stiff, clumsy with haste. He strode toward her, closing the distance in 3 long strides, and the world, which had been a wide, hazy panorama, suddenly contracted to the space between them. He didn't speak. He simply shrugged out of his heavy canvas ranch coat, the one that smelled of horse and leather and the faint, clean scent of the sun on dry grass. He wrapped it around her shoulders. The weight of it was a sudden, grounding comfort, a heavy, solid anchor in the sea of her trembling. It was still warm from his body, and she leaned into it, A small, involuntary movement, drawing strength from its heat and its familiar, masculine scent. As he settled the coat around her, his hand brushed against her arm, and then his fingers, rough and calloused, found the back of her hand. He stopped. His gaze dropped to where his fingers rested, and he saw the dark, ugly smear of dried blood on her skin from the fall she had taken on Raven's shelf. His touch, which had been quick and proprietary, gentled. His thumb moved with an infinite slowness over the wound, tracing its edge, feeling the grit and the torn skin beneath. He stayed like that for a long, silent moment, his head bowed, his fingers resting on her wound as if in prayer, as if he could absorb the pain of it into himself. It was a touch that acknowledged everything: her fall in the dark, her courage at the bridge, the price she had paid to stand here now. When he finally looked up, the hard mask of the rancher, the soldier, the widower, was gone. His face was stripped bare, and in his eyes, she saw a terrifying, profound vulnerability. A look of a man who had just been forced to stare into the abyss of a loss he knew he could not survive a second time. "I thought I'd lost you," he said. His voice was a ruin. It was a low, fractured sound, as rough and broken as gravel grinding in the bed of a dry creek. It was the sound of a man who had screamed himself hoarse into a silent, indifferent void. Ivy's heart ached at the raw, undisguised pain in that sound. She could have offered him comfort, reassurance. She could have told him she was all right. But she knew that words were not what this moment required. This moment required a truth that was as solid and as real as the ground beneath their feet. Her hand, the one that was not trembling, went to the pocket of her dress. Her fingers closed around the cool, heavy shape of the silver lighter. She pulled it out. It lay in her palm, its polished surface dull in the gray light, the engraved B a stark, simple statement. She held it out to him, offering it back. "I'm returning this," she said, her own voice quiet but steady, a clear, true note in the heavy silence. He looked at the lighter, then back at her, his expression confused. "Because I'm not leaving." The meaning of her words settled over him, slow and profound. She wasn't just his hired help, a transient seamstress finishing a job. She was putting down roots. She was staying. The lighter had been a tool, a symbol of a temporary trust given for a specific, desperate task. By returning it, she was telling him that their trust was no longer temporary, no longer symbolic. It was a permanent, living thing between them now. He didn't take it. He simply stared at her, his breath catching in his throat, the space between them. Already charged with the aftershock of violence and confession, now hummed with a new, even more powerful energy. The air was thick, heavy, each particle a potential spark, their breaths, visible as faint plumes in the cool, damp air, met and mingled in the scant inches that separated their faces. It was Ivy who broke the spell. She looked directly into his eyes, her gaze unflinching, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a challenge that was also a plea. "Don't go slow." He understood. This was not about running from a stampede. This was not about chasing outlaws. This was about them, about the hesitant, dangerous dance they had been engaged in since the moment she had stitched his saddle. It was about the walls he had built around his heart, and her quiet, persistent refusal to be kept out. She was telling him that the time for caution, for hesitation, for the slow, painful grieving of the past was over. Life was too short, too brutal, too precious to be wasted in the shadows. He leaned in, his face so close now that she could feel the warmth of his skin, could see the intricate map of exhaustion and hope in his eyes. He moved with a deliberate, heart-stopping slowness that was a direct contradiction to her command, drawing out the moment, savoring it. "Then how fast, darlin'," he whispered, and the word, that single simple endearment, spoken for the first time in his rough, gravelly voice, was the spark that ignited the air between them. The kiss came before she could answer, before she could even breathe. It was not a gentle, tentative exploration. It was a collision. It was the desperate, hungry meeting of two souls who had been starved for warmth, for connection, for the simple, profound affirmation of being alive. His lips were chapped and tasted of dust and coffee and something that was uniquely, elementally him. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her damp, messy hair, holding her to him as if he were afraid she might evaporate in his arms. And at that exact moment, the fine, gray mist of dust and ash gave way to a real rain. The drops were cold and heavy, falling with a sudden, drumming intensity, as if the sky itself had finally broken open and wept. The rain streamed down their faces, mingling with the dust and the grime, washing them clean. It soaked his shirt and her borrowed coat. But they didn't feel the cold. A fire had been lit in the center of her chest, a roaring, brilliant blaze that consumed the last of her fear, her exhaustion, her loneliness. It was a fire that had been sparked by a shared glance, kindled by whispered confessions in a storm, and now, in this kiss, had finally erupted into a wild, uncontrollable conflagration. It was a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and rain, of loss and hope, of endings and beginnings. A frantic, high-pitched barking shattered the spell. It was Thimble, the little ranch dog, who had somehow followed the wagon guards and was now dancing around their feet, announcing his presence and his disapproval of this strange, quiet moment. They broke apart, gasping, their foreheads resting against each other, the world slowly rushing back in. In the distance, a horn sounded, a clear, brassy note from one of the postal guards, a call for the wounded, a signal that order was being restored. They were no longer alone. They were part of the world again, a world of consequences and responsibilities. Ivy pulled back, a slow, genuine laugh bubbling up from her chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, a sound of joy in the midst of the wreckage. She looked up at him, her face wet with rain, her eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with the dismal gray sky. "As fast as the bullets were flying," she said, finally answering his question. A slow smile spread across Beau's face, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his harsh, grim features, erasing the lines of pain and grief. It was the smile of a man who had forgotten how, a man who had just been reminded. He reached up and gently tucked a stray, wet strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her cheek. "And more durable," he whispered, his voice no longer a ruin, but a low, steady promise, like the stitches you sew. Justice in Red Wind Bluff was not an abstract concept debated in paneled courtrooms. It was a practical, immediate thing, administered with the same unadorned efficiency as butchering a hog or setting a fence post. There was no courthouse, so the town's large, cavernous grain barn was commandeered. The place smelled of old hay, dry earth, and the faint, sweet scent of rodent poison. Shafts of dusty golden light cut through the gaps in the wall slats, illuminating a makeshift courtroom. Sheriff Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard-won experience, presided from a table set upon a stack of feed sacks. The jury was a collection of grim-faced ranchers and merchants who had seen too much to be easily swayed by tears or rhetoric. The accused were a sorry sight. The half-dozen captured members of Jackson's crew were bound together with thick rope, their faces a mixture of sullen defiance and weary resignation. They were the grist for the mill of frontier justice, their fates all but sealed. Separate from them, propped against a pile of burlap sacks, was Reeves Dalton. Beau's bullet had not killed him outright, but it had shattered something deep inside him, and life was now leaking from him like water from a split bag. His breath was a shallow, ragged affair, and a bloody froth flecked his lips. But his eyes were lucid, burning with a feverish, spiteful fire. He had confessed, not out of remorse, but out of a final, venomous desire to drag the world down with him. As the sheriff and the town doctor listened, He had rasped out the whole sordid tale of the fire that killed Elena Strickland. It was a story of drunken carelessness, of a backfire set with a reckless disregard for the wind, of a woman's pleas ignored. He spoke of it with a chilling detachment, as if recounting a minor inconvenience. And in doing so, he damned himself more completely than any witness ever could. His confession hung in the dusty air, a toxic cloud that settled over the proceedings. Then came Jackson Redding. He was not bound with the others. His arm was in a clean sling, and he stood before the sheriff not as a cowering supplicant, but as a man making a final, desperate accounting of his life. He did not ask for a pardon. He asked for a chance to pay his debt in a currency other than the short drop and sudden stop of a rope. "I won't tell you I'm a good man," Jackson said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the barn. "My life's ledger has more red ink than black. I rode with him. I planned this robbery. For that, I deserve to be punished." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent, watching faces. "But I did not kill, and I did not stand by while a good woman burned. I tried to save her." He looked directly at Bo, a raw, pleading honesty in his eyes. "Reeves held a gun on me, told me she was the price of my silence." He then laid out his offer, in exchange for a sentence of hard labor. He would lead the sheriff to 3 separate caches where the gang had stored gold from previous robberies. More than that, he would give them the name of the railroad agent in Wyeth Spur who had been their inside man, the one feeding them schedules and manifests for a cut of the profits. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a business proposition. His life, in exchange for a justice that was far more complete, far more satisfying than a single hanging. Sheriff Miller listened, his face impassive, and then he turned his gaze to Ivy. "Miss Lockridge, your testimony, if you please." All eyes in the barn turned to her. She walked to the center of the room, her step steady, her posture erect. She wore a simple dress, the one she had arrived in, now mended and clean. She looked neither right nor left, her focus entirely on the sheriff. She began to speak, and a profound silence fell over the barn. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and sharp, each word a carefully chosen tool. She spoke of the postal stamp from Wyeth Spur, of the decoy bridge, of the map found on the unconscious lookout. She recounted her conversation with Jackson under the bridge, his words of wanting a chance to be a man again. And then she described his confession, the terror and agony in his voice as he named Reeves Dalton as the one responsible for the fire. Her words were not an emotional appeal. They were a plow, cutting a deep, straight furrow through the dry, fallow ground of rumor and speculation. She laid bare the facts, one after another, creating a clear, undeniable path from cause to effect, from greed to violence, from an old lie to the present truth. She was not a victim, not a heroine. She was a witness, and her testimony was absolute. Throughout it all, Bo stood near the back of the barn, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but inside, a seismic shift was occurring. For 3 years, he had been a prisoner of his own memory. He had replayed that terrible night 1,000 times, each time seeing his own failure, his own inability to save his wife. The fire had not just taken Elena. It had consumed his past and mortgaged his future to a crippling, suffocating guilt. The what-ifs had been the bars of his cage. What if he had been faster? What if he had chosen a different spot for the camp? What if he had seen the danger sooner? Reeves Dalton's spittled, spiteful confession, and Ivy's clear, factual accounting of Jackson's words did not erase his grief, but they reframed it. Elena's death had not been an accident, a random act of a cruel fate that he had failed to prevent. It had been a choice, another man's choice, another man's malice. It was a subtle distinction, but it was the difference between a prison and a grave. You could walk away from a prison. As Ivy spoke, he felt the heavy, rusted latch on the door to his heart, a mechanism seized by 3 years of unwept tears and unspoken rage, slowly, painfully, begin to give way. The truth, delivered by this woman who had seen the worst of him and had not flinched, was the key. For the first time, he could remember Elena's laugh without it being immediately choked by the smell of smoke. The past was still a scar, but it was no longer a perpetually open wound. When Ivy finished, the silence in the barn was so profound that you could hear the soft rustle of a mouse in the hayloft. Sheriff Miller looked at the jury, who exchanged a few brief, murmured words before their foreman nodded. No deliberation was needed. The truth was as plain as the daylight striping the floor. The verdict was swift, a reflection of the practical, unsentimental nature of the land itself. Reeves Dalton, his confession his own death warrant, was sentenced to hang, but it was a sentence that would never be carried out. The doctor announced that he wouldn't last the night, and he was carried off to the town's small infirmary to meet his maker under a roof instead of a rope. Jackson Redding's proposition was accepted. His life was spared in exchange for the gold in the railroad agent. He was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor, to be served in a federal prison far from these territories. It was a harsh sentence, but it was a sentence of life. As the deputy led him away, he caught Ivy's eye and gave a single, small nod. A nod of thanks, a nod of farewell. The rest of the crew were given sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. Justice in Red Wind Bluff had been served. The town exhaled. The tension that had held it in a stranglehold for weeks finally broke. In the days that followed, a new energy took hold. A collection was taken up to rebuild the main bridge on the stage road. The one Jackson's crew had sabotaged. The townspeople gave what they could, a few dollars, a day's labor, a promise of lumber. That evening, Finch, the sour-faced barkeep of the Salt Cedar Saloon, took a piece of chalk and, on the large slate board behind the bar where he usually listed whiskey prices, he wrote a single name in large, clear letters, Ivy Lockridge. He added no title, no explanation. None was needed. The next morning, the owner of the general store, the same man who had once told her that people in Redwind bought more bullets than needles, sought her out. He held his dusty hat in his hands, his demeanor a world away from their first encounter. He had a large consignment of canvas tarps, torn and damaged from years of use. He offered her a contract, a real one, with pay in cash, to mend them all. It was her first real commission, a foundation stone laid in the hard, unforgiving soil of this new land. She had an anchor. She had a future. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet, she stood with Bo on the porch of the ranch house. The world was quiet, peaceful. The only sounds were the lowing of the distant cattle and the soft sigh of the evening breeze through the tall grass. They stood in a comfortable silence, watching the day end. Will you go or will you stay? Bo's question was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. He didn't look at her as he said it. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the vast, open country that stretched out before them. But the question hung in the air between them, holding all the weight of their shared future, all the unspoken hopes and fears that had brought them to this moment. It was the most important question he had ever asked. Ivy looked out at that same horizon, at the endless expanse of land and sky, a landscape that had once seemed so intimidating, so empty. Now, it looked like a promise. It looked like freedom. Then, she lowered her gaze, turning from the vastness of the world to the small, intimate space between them. She looked at his hand, resting on the porch rail. It was a strong hand, calloused and scarred by work and by fighting. A hand that had known how to hold a rifle, how to soothe a horse, how to gently bandage a wound. It was the hand of the man she had come to know, and the man she had come to love. She reached out and placed her own hand over his.
I don't go slow,
she said, her voice soft but sure, a perfect echo of the promise she had made to him and to herself.
but I go with you.
He turned to her then, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled into dust. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his storm-gray eyes, and in them, she saw her future. He squeezed her hand, a silent, binding contract. Inside the nearby grain barn, now empty and quiet, a stray gust of wind found its way through a crack in the wall. It swirled through the dusty, sun-drenched air, catching the tiny golden motes of chaff and dust that still hung in the shafts of evening light. And for a brief, magical moment, it set them to dancing, 1,000 tiny points of light spinning and whirling together in a silent, joyous celebration. The first light of dawn is a thief. It comes silently, stealing the deep, velvet black from the sky and replacing it with a bruised purple, then a soft, pearly gray. On the high plains of the Coyote Lantern Ranch, this first light was a promise, a daily act of creation. It spilled over the jagged peaks of Raven Shelf, no longer a place of menace, but simply a feature of the landscape, and flowed like liquid gold into the long wooden trough that stood near the main house. The water in the trough, clean and still, captured the nascent light, holding it in its cool depths, a chalice filled with the day's new hope. After a long and brutal season of thirst, the simple sight of a full water trough was a miracle, a quiet testament to the resilience of the land and of the heart. A few weeks had passed since the fire and fury in Dry Comet Basin. The territory had exhaled, settling back into its familiar rhythms of sun and wind, work and rest. But something fundamental had shifted, both on the land and within the two people who called it home. The change was palpable, as real as the cool morning air. Ivy stood on a small wooden stool, a hammer in one hand, a nail held between her teeth. She was hanging her new sign. It was a handsome piece of work, a solid plank of pine that Bo had sanded for her until it was as smooth as silk. She had spent 2 days painting it, her touch as precise with a brush as it was with a needle. The letters were a deep, confident blue, the color of a summer sky just after a rainstorm. They spelled out a name and a philosophy, a declaration of her new place in this world. A Lockridge Stitchery, we mend what time breaks. The words were her own. They had come to her one evening as she sat watching Bo patiently repair a broken harness, his large, rough hands working with a surprising gentleness. She had realized then that they were both in the same trade. He mended the broken things of the ranch, the fences, the gear, the spirits of his weary cattle. She mended the torn fabric of people's lives. And together, they were mending each other, stitching together the frayed edges of their solitary pasts to create a new, stronger whole. With a final, decisive tap of the hammer, she drove the last nail home. She stepped back to admire her work. The sign hung straight and true against the weathered wood of the small outbuilding that was now her dedicated workshop. It looked as if it had always been there. A short distance away, another sound of creation rang out in the crisp air. It was the rhythmic, solid thud of Bo's hammer. He was not mending an old fence. He was building something new. The unseasonal rains had been a blessing, a down payment from a sky that had been a miser for too long. The parched earth had drunk its fill, and deep in the heart of the ranch, a miracle had occurred. Blue Lantern Creek, which had been nothing more than a boneyard of white stones, was flowing again. It was not a torrent, but a steady, determined trickle of clear, cold water, a silver artery bringing life back to the land. Bo was building a new flume, a series of interconnected troughs that would channel this newfound life from the creek to the main well and the new vegetable garden Ivy had insisted on planting. His work was a form of prayer, a hymn of gratitude sung with a hammer and nails. Each blow was a punctuation mark in a new chapter of his life. For 3 years, he had been a man living in a state of perpetual drought, his heart as dry and cracked as the creek bed. He had survived, but he had not truly lived. Now, with the return of the water, he felt something deep within him begin to flow again. The grief for Elena would always be a part of him, a smooth, worn stone in the river of his memory, but it no longer dammed the current. The water was moving again, and it was moving toward a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. The two sounds, the sharp, metallic clatter, clatter, clatter of Ivy's sewing machine from her new workshop, and the solid, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of Bo's hammer by the creek, became the new heartbeat of the Coyote Lantern Ranch. They were separate sounds, born of separate labors, but they rose and fell in a natural, unforced harmony. It was the sound of a life being built, a duet of creation. It was the music of a partnership, a quiet, industrious symphony that spoke of shared purpose and a future constructed together, one stitch, one nail at a time. They learned to ride together, not as employer and employee, but as equals, two skilled riders moving across the vast, open canvas of the plains. In the beginning, he had led, showing her the hidden trails, the best grazing spots, the secret places where the wild sage grew thickest. But soon, a new pattern emerged. A playful, unspoken challenge would pass between them, a glint in Ivy's eye, a twitch at the corner of Bo's mouth, and she would be off. She would urge her horse forward, leaning low over its neck, her laughter a bright, clean sound carried back on the wind. She was a fearless rider, her connection to her mount a fluid, intuitive thing, and he would follow. He would give her a head start, a grin spreading across his face, and then he would urge his own powerful stallion into a gallop. The chase was on. He would pursue her across the golden fields, the wind whipping at his face, the thunder of their horses' hooves the only sound in the world. He was no longer just a rancher, grimly surveying his domain. He was a man alive, filled with a joy so pure and so potent it felt like a physical force inside his chest. He would watch her, a study in grace and freedom, her hair coming loose from its pins and flying behind her like a dark banner. And he would laugh. It was a sound that had been a stranger to him for 3 long years, a deep, full-throated sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. It was a sound she had given back to him. This afternoon, they had ridden far, to the very edge of his property, a place where the rolling grasslands met a wide, flat expanse of sun-baked earth. It was here, at the border between the tamed and the wild, that she finally pulled her horse to a stop. He rode up beside her, reining in his own mount. Their horses stood side by side, their sides heaving, their coats gleaming with sweat. The sun was warm on their faces, and a profound, peaceful silence settled around them. Ivy turned in her saddle to face him. Her face was flushed from the ride, her eyes sparkling with life and a kind of fierce, joyful energy. The playful light in them softened, replaced by a look of gentle, serious intent. She looked at him, really looked at him, and he felt as if she could see straight through to the very core of him. "Don't go slow," she said. The words were the same ones she had spoken to him in the aftermath of the battle. A whisper in the gray, gritty rain. But here, now, in the warm sunlight, they held a different meaning. They were not a plea born of desperation, but a statement of principle. It was her creed, the philosophy that had carried her across a continent and through fire and fear. And now, it was an invitation. Bo felt his heart give a powerful, single thump against his ribs. It was a feeling that was still new to him, this wild, untamed thing that lived in his chest now, this heart that had been resurrected from the ashes of his past. He urged his horse a single step closer, until their knees were almost touching. He leaned across the small space that separated them. He didn't kiss her. Instead, he gently rested his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, more connecting than any kiss. He closed his eyes, and the world disappeared. There was only the warmth of her skin, the soft scent of her hair, and the gentle rhythm of her breathing. He could feel the pulse of her life, steady and strong, against his own. "As fast as my heart," he whispered, the words a solemn vow spoken into the small, sacred space between them. She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that held all the understanding, all the acceptance, all the love in the world. She pulled back, her eyes shining, and with a single, joyous whoop, she spurred her horse forward, launching them into a gallop across the wide, open plain. He was right beside her this time, not chasing, but accompanying. They rode side by side, two halves of a whole, their horses moving as one. They raced across the dry earth, their horses' hooves kicking up a great cloud of red dust behind them. The setting sun caught the cloud, igniting it, transforming the mundane dust into a brilliant, sparkling plume of crimson and gold, a glorious, celebratory spray of earthy fireworks. Far in the distance, the small, resilient town of Red Wind Bluff was settling in for the evening, its lamps beginning to glow like fallen stars. A new tailor shop had put down roots there. A ranch, once crippled by drought and grief, was now thriving, its heart beating strong and steady. And on a dusty trail, under a vast and promising sky, a man and a woman rode toward their future, bound by a promise to never be slow, to never be late, to always move at the speed of a heart that has, against all odds, learned to beat again. The story doesn't end. It simply finds its rhythm, out here on the trail, where courage is measured in speed, and love, finally, is always right on time. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your corner of the world and your thoughts on Ivy and Bo's journey. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help share it with more listeners like you.